Good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm chatting with Bennett Tomlin from the Crypto Critics podcast. For anybody who's followed crypto on Twitter, you have probably noticed that there is this gaslighting tendency that exists amongst various crypto influencers to try to convince you that their scams are legitimate investment grade opportunities. I first found Bennett a couple of years ago on Twitter, and I quickly noticed that he was calling out all the scams in a very clear, concise manner that made incoherent gaslighting sound like coherent, reasonable criticism. Bennett has absolutely blown up on Twitter the last couple of years as everybody has realized that there's only a few guys that you can turn to that can explain the incoherent mess that many of these crypto scams are and make us understand exactly what's happening and why we should avoid these. Just to give you one example, Bennett called out Sam Bankman-Fried back in May because Bennett thought that Alameda Research's investment strategy was going to end in tears. In this interview, we get Bennett's thoughts about everything that's happening in the world, how he knew that Alameda was going to fail, and I ask Bennett where he thinks that the puck is going in terms of the next big crypto failure. Guys, I'm really grateful that Bennett took the time to sit down and chat with us. He's had massive success in his career, and I bet that if you watch him the next few years, he's only going to get bigger as he's one of the very few guys that can concisely call out all the bullshit that exists out there. All right, everyone, enjoy the interview. Bennett, thanks so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Okay, so one of the things that I love about just watching your various appearances on YouTube, listening to your podcast, is your ability to just take these complicated concepts that for anybody who's on social media, I'd say we're often gaslighted on by the various people in the crypto community that try to make these things to be much more complicated than they actually are. So I'm thrilled to have you on here and ask you a couple of questions with everything that's going on in the world to maybe help me make a little bit more sense of everything. The first thing I got to ask you about here is this FTT token. I'm really fascinated by this because it gets thrown around on the internet occasionally that it represented equity, but apparently it actually didn't. So explain to our audience, if you would, what an FTT token actually is and what the ultimate value was for the user who would purchase this.
FTT token or FTX token, like many other exchange tokens, including Bitfinex's Leo, Binance's BNB, Huobi's HT, or any of these other ones, are pseudo equity, basically. They offer people who hold them a discount on the trading fees associated with the exchange. And then the exchange agrees to use a portion of their revenue, normally a flat percentage of their trading fees, to go out, repurchase, and then burn these tokens with the goal of driving value to the remaining set of tokens in the ecosystem. So FTT specifically was the token issued by FTX that enabled people who had it to get a discount on their trading fees at FTX. And FTX agreed until half the supply of FTX token was repurchased to use 1/3 of all of their trading fees to go out and repurchase FTX token and then burn it. So people could hold these tokens and get equity-like exposure, pseudo-equity exposure to the revenue flows without actually holding equity in the business itself.
Okay, so ultimately, these FTT tokens, they underpinned, I suppose they weren't originally supposed to, but they were underpinning Alameda's balance sheet, correct?
Absolutely true. CoinDesk, now almost 2 weeks ago, reported on a portion of Alameda's balance sheet, which revealed that it was dominated by FTX token. And that not only that, but Alameda was valuing the amount of FTX token they had at, I think it was 130% of what CoinMarketCap had as the market cap for all of FTX token in circulation at that point. So Alameda Research, the Sam Bankman-Fried founded hedge fund, quantitative trading firm, and venture capital firm, was massively overexposed to FTX, the exchange, co-founded by Sam Bankman-Fried and run by Sam Bankman-Fried, and had all these loans out against these assets that put them in this really challenging position, which then led to the rest of the collapse we've seen since then.
Do we know if FTX was supposed to hold on to any certain level of cash reserve for these FTT tokens? Was there anything in the terms of the white paper?
So no, I don't think there's anything like that for the FTX token. The bigger thing that was going on there with FTX is that they were supposed to be holding all of their customer deposits in reserves. So any assets that people had deposited at FTX were supposed to still be at FTX. But the realization people are having is that Alameda Research effectively took all of the customer deposits from FTX in order to supposedly pay back their own loans. But yeah, and so that's what happened is FTX was supposed to be holding all of this Bitcoin, all of this Ether, all of these tokens from people who had deposited them to trade at FTX. But instead, Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX had sent all of those over to Alameda to help fund Alameda's continued gambling and speculation across the cryptocurrency ecosystem.
Were people trading crypto in FTT or would they predominantly be using Tether on FTX? I'm not sure if you can answer that, but
yeah. So FTX had banking. And so generally when people were trading dollars on FTX, they were trading dollars. And like we saw when Tether froze the tethers that were still at FTX a couple days ago, there was only like 45 million or something tethers in total at FTX. And so people would trade FTX token, but it generally wasn't what it was being quoted in. It wasn't the base of the pair. It was just an asset people would trade against dollars generally with the hope of it going up. And the idea was if more and more people traded on FTX, if more and more people used FTX products, FTX would gather more fees and they would use more fees to then go out and buy FTX tokens from people who had them, keeping them valuable for the holders of FTX token.
So Bennett, I noticed that your partner in crime, Cass, tweeted out a tweet from you back in May where you tweeted at Sam Bankman-Fried, "Hey, SBF_FTX, I just wanted to inform you that your hedge fund seems to be invested in a scheme that is transparently going to falter again." To which SBF actually responded, "I don't run Alameda anymore. You should ask them." 2, note that creating/redeeming does not necessarily mean investing. So Bennett, I got to ask you, what was going through your head at the time that you tweeted this at Sam Bankman-Fried? How did you know back in May that Alameda was likely to fail?
So at this point, what it was that Alameda Research had invested in Anchor, which was the yield that drove the growth of the Terra ecosystem. And after the collapse of the Terra ecosystem, and both Terra and Luna were listed on FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried came out and made a statement that the Luna Terra system was one that was transparently going to falter. And so at the time, I called him out saying, if you knew this was transparently going to falter, it was not moral for you to list it on your exchange and have people investing and buying into this scheme that you knew was unsustainable, because the terminal value of any unsustainable scheme is going to be zero. And if you are aware of that, then selling it to people who do not realize that terminal value is zero is going to be unethical. Then, after Sam made this comment and tried to pretend that he saw the collapse of Luna despite listing it and having his hedge fund invest in it, Alameda Research became one of the partners for USDD, which is basically a copy of Terra that was started by perennial crypto scammer Justin Sun, who's also the Grenada ambassador to the World Trade Organization now. He started USDD, which was basically a copy of Terra, and Alameda Research was one of the firms that was immediately announced as one that would be helping manage the reserve for it. So when this was, because it was the exact same scheme that Sam said was transparently going to falter, I made this tweet, tongue-in-cheek, to be like, "Hey Sam, you're doing the thing again. It's right there." And then Sam responded saying, "I don't run Alameda. I've got no idea what's going on over there. You should ask them," which was a lie.
I know you can't answer this because I assume that you've never ran an institutional level investment fund.
That is correct.
But what were these institutional investors thinking when they deployed capital into this exchange that didn't even have a board? It was just Sam had the ability to basically do whatever he wanted because he was a one-man board, or there wasn't a board. I find that part very hard to wrap my head around. Here in Ontario, we've got the Ontario Teachers Pension Fund, which is a very well-respected fund. They're known for having generated great returns for their pensioners. And here you read that they kicked in something like, I forget what the number was, it was like 95 million or something like that into FTX, into a structure that doesn't even have a board of directors. Sam
did a really good job of managing his appearance. I don't know exactly who his PR team was, but they did a fantastic job, like from the time he launched FTX, of trying to get him in front of the right media people and with the right framing to make him seem like this good-hearted philanthropist who is doing everything he does for the good of humanity, who's interested in being legitimate, who's talking to these lawmakers and these regulators because he wants FTX to be a legitimate, serious exchange. Meanwhile, while he's creating this appearance, he's doing the same thing we've seen from so many of the other offshore exchanges, in terms of like trying to actually avoid most of that regulatory scrutiny, and even like following the Binance example of having your main liquidity be this offshore exchange, but then setting up a US domiciled one to try to draw the US regulators' attention to that entity instead of your primary entity. And so Sam was very clever in that he understood that if he could convince these people, if he could create the appearance that he was legitimate, he would be able to then act as if he was legitimate even while doing all of these illegitimate things. And so he really leaned into the effective altruism and the idea that he was this philanthropist. And then by giving these very large political donations in 2020, he then further legitimized himself in the eyes of lawmakers and regulators. And so after you've done that, after you've gotten all of this press as this billionaire philanthropist who has flown up the charts of the richest people in the world with the intention of earning all of this just to give it away, while contributing to all of these powerful people, you end up in a position where you have this aura of legitimacy around you, even when your operations themselves are not legitimate. And so I think many investors invested because they saw that aura and didn't actually care whether or not the thing itself was legitimate, because there were the markers of legitimacy surrounding it.
That was just an exceptional rant. Why do you think the media was so just so kind to him? Do you think I think it might have been, I forget who I read say it on Twitter, but they didn't want to lose access to Sam. Do you think it was just, it turned into a media groupthink and everybody convinced themselves that Sam was the real deal, going to be the next Jamie Dimon of the crypto world, of which FTX was going to be the JP Morgan? Why did the media love this guy so much?
I think because in many ways he kind of fit like their archetype for what a legitimate exchange owner should look like. He had come with Wall Street experience, had this time as a trader, went to Ivy League schools in the United States, was willing to talk to regulators, testify in front of Congress, have all these conversations, be photographed with these lawmakers, and give these interviews, all while paying lip service to this idea that he was going to build this very legitimate thing. And so as you have this person who is growing so fast, like incredible growth compared to many of these other institutions, I think a lot of people were in a position where there was not yet clear evidence of wrongdoing. And it is what you're talking about, where there is this desire to maintain access, because going forward, if FTX is going to be one of the largest exchanges, if they are going to dominate liquidity, if they are going to be this like massive entity controlling this portion of cryptocurrency, it is very easy to convince yourself as a journalist that it is very important right now for you to make sure you develop those relationships. So going forward, you'll be able to continue to report on this entity. And so I think because there hadn't been like a clear cut, really easy to point to example of their malfeasance, it was easy for people to get sucked along with some of the marketing and stuff like that and try to maintain that access going forward. Broadly, I think our tech and financial journalism has suffered from a lack of skepticism about many claims. And we see this with a variety of startups coming out of Silicon Valley and fintech startups coming out of everywhere, where their initial growth, funded by these large investments of these major VCs, their valuation growth seems so incredible early on that it is very easy to print those positive stories about growth, about the future, about if we draw this line through these points so far, look at how high it could go. It is way easier to do that than to look at this thing and do a whole bunch of extra effort to evaluate each claim individually, to try to determine if it's true. And so when there's not yet a strong incentive to do that, because FTX is still so much, like even at its peak, FTX had meaningfully less liquidity than Binance and some of these other exchanges. And so while it was still on that upswing, it was easier to benefit from the upswing than to put the effort into trying to forestall it or to point out things or to draw attention towards some of the flaws, because that requires a lot more investment of time and energy. And in doing so, you risk potentially blowing this future relationship if the thing you discover is not substantial enough to actually slow it down, but is substantial enough for you to lose that access.
I got to ask you about Tether. I know you get asked about the unpegging of Tether all the time, and for the most part, it probably drives you nuts. But I got to ask, last week it did briefly, I think it broke 99 cents. And then out of nowhere, I think it was Tron announced that they were going to step up and buy $1 billion worth of Tether. What's going on here? Was there a moment where Tether almost did get into a bit of trouble?
I don't have any sort.
And why would Tron decide to step in?
I don't have any sources inside of Tether, so I can't speak to their internal posture stance as this all was going on. But you're right, there was a depeg of Tether. They got down to 98.5, I think. And then the Tron DAO Reserve, which is behind that scheme that's transparently going to falter, USDD, that I was referring to a little bit ago. The Tron DAO Reserve did announce that they were interested in potentially purchasing up to 1 billion tethers, which is an incredible thing for them to promise because they have 750 million in assets and reserves. So how exactly they're going to transform that, which is dominated by their own token Tron, into $1 billion to purchase tethers is unclear to me, but no one else thought to ask that question.
I have a theory, these are not Bennett's direct words, but this is my theory. So I believe that one of the things that Tether does is that they just come up with agreements with various companies where, they're selling Tether effectively at a discount, and that's where the commercial paper goes. So it's, hey, if you guys pick up, $100 million, we'll give you $300 million worth of Tether. You think that that's possible, or am I just crazy? And I don't know what the ratio is, but I assume that they're offering Tether at a discount if somebody steps in and picks it up.
It's possible that Tethers have been offered at a discount. We know, for example, that Circle has offered rebates on USDC before. We know that for a while, Gemini was selling GUSD at less than $1 to try to stimulate growth. And so it's possible Tether's done the same thing. It is challenging to get anyone to admit that. The other challenge with Tether is that, if they are doing exactly what they say and only taking dollars for tethers, at this point, they're throwing off hundreds of millions of dollars in yield. And it is unclear where that yield is going. And I am skeptical that it all goes into the operations of Tether. And so there's this strange thing when you look at Tether's reserves, where for every Tether they issued, they initially got $1, and then they took that dollar and invested it in relatively safe and stable things like treasuries and these other things they're supposedly investing in. There should be a whole bunch of additional yield coming in, and their reserves should look strong and steady. And yet still there's these weird parts of the reserve that don't seem to match that. And where the yield goes is still entirely unclear. And so it is very possible, in my opinion, that many people have gotten tethers for less than $1. What exactly those transactions look like is still unknown. And I think this kind of gets at what you're leading into more broadly, which is what type of exposure could Tether have to FTX and Alameda? And the answer to that is they could have very large exposure. They could have no exposure at all. If Tether is being honest and they're only taking dollars for their tethers, then they have basically no exposure. They lose one of the biggest arbitrageurs who helps keep it at peg, and they lose one of the people who has the most demand for tethers because Alameda was the single largest issuer of new tethers, but their reserves should be fine. Now, if Tether has been lying and deceiving us all and the people providing their attestations and stuff and entering into more complicated and bespoke financial transactions where they're taking on other assets to issue tethers, then their exposure could be catastrophic and it could ruin the entire industry. So it's somewhere on the spectrum from nothing at all to absolutely catastrophic.
Something that's floating around on Twitter, and I saw you tweeting about today, is this idea that somehow FTX was putting money into the Democratic Party, and there's supposed to be some sort of connection to Ukraine here. Do you think that this is just a bunch of conspiracy nuts, or is there actually something to this?
It's basically all conspiracy nuts. Breaking it down, there's a couple of different claims here. One is like the claim that Elon was making, which is that Sam is going to avoid investigation because he was Biden's second largest donor. This is already BS. Protos reported back on October 7th that our Freedom of Information Act requests about FTX were already being denied with law enforcement exemptions. Wall Street Journal reported a couple days ago that they're under SEC and Department of Justice investigation. There are multiple investigations ongoing of these entities, and Sam's status as a Democratic donor is not going to make those investigations go away. And I think that it's actually plausible that they are going to end up drawing more attention to Sam than they would have if he had never donated at all. Because now the optics for the Democratic Party, especially since it is very likely that the person they'll be running against in 2024 has effectively adopted corruption as his official platform, that they're going to want to pitch themselves as anti-corruption. And so going after these large entities, their own donors who are committing these massive frauds, helps them show that you can't buy yourself out of this in our party, and is a good thing for them to pitch heading into the elections, right? And so that's the first part. I don't think his status as a mega donor is going to help him, and it could actually hurt him. The other part is one of the other executives of FTX Digital Markets, Ryan Salami, was one of the largest Republican donors, giving millions and millions of dollars to major Republican super PACs and stuff like that. And even Sam Bankman-Fried himself was donating to Republican super PACs, including to ones that exclusively advanced Trump-endorsed election deniers. And FTX's giving itself was entirely to Republican-leaning and Republican-focused super PACs. Like, the idea that FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried were some Democratic plant is nonsense. Now, the other part about Ukraine that's going around is that FTX helped Ukraine convert some of the crypto they received into fiat. And as far as I can tell, that's all that happened. That's all that was announced, is that FTX would be the one helping facilitate the sale of the crypto into actual money that Ukraine wanted to spend on actual things. And so once that transaction was done, I see no reason to believe that Ukraine had significant other assets on FTX that are now gone. And then a whole bunch of other people online have begun trying to conflate the U.S. foreign aid that's been given to Ukraine in a variety of ways with the crypto donations that individual people gave, which is what FTX helped convert. And so the entire thing has been just connecting a bunch of points in a totally slapshod manner without actually paying attention to the broader picture. So I don't think there's any real conspiracy here where Sam is some secret Democratic plant to destroy crypto, or where FTX is somehow involved in laundering foreign aid to Ukraine or anything like that. I think FTX just saw a great marketing opportunity to be the ones who made this transaction and put their name on it. And so they did. They made the transaction and they put their name on it and took the marketing benefits from that.
Okay, so something that I find really fascinating is this idea that we got FTX. It is like the most reputable exchange. If you're watching the media, probably should be Coinbase because they got listed on a major exchange. But Brian Armstrong has had some epically stupid rants on Twitter. But what I find fascinating here is that we've got what appears to be the most reputable exchange. It failed. Now, if I have any serious money on any exchange, I'm freaking out. I'm getting all my money off. And I assume that that's happening to some extent. Reasonable, rational people are going, yikes, this is probably not a great place to be deploying capital. So I got to ask you, what are you watching next in terms of the various exchanges or various funds? I know you don't have a crystal ball. The problem is that there's no transparency, so it's impossible to predict what happens next. But there's got to be areas that you are fascinated with and you're checking regularly.
Yes, there are several. Genesis Trading, which is one of the largest over-the-counter trading desks and loan books in all of cryptocurrency, originally announced that they had $7 million in credit losses related to Alameda and FTX, and then got an emergency equity infusion of $140 million from their parent company, and then came out and said, oh yeah, we also had $140 million in assets over on FTX that we're not going to be able to get out anymore. And there are persistent rumors in certain corners of the cryptocurrency world that they may have other bad debts that they have yet to mark down yet. And so I think it's possible that Genesis, we've already seen Genesis initially gave one number and then revised it 2 days later as soon as they had been able to get their equity infusion from their parent company. And so I am still keeping a very close eye on them, especially since they, if you look on chain, were like the largest non-Alameda over-the-counter trading book where you could see FTX token flowing through. And like at one point had over 3 million FTX tokens on their books right before like the CoinDesk date when they were looking at it. And then you see them all like transferred off Genesis's books right before the June 30th date that CoinDesk saw. So I'm looking at that. I'm still paying a lot of attention to Binance, but mostly just to see where they're going after. There were some really weird flows of Ethereum from FTX to Alameda Research's Binance deposit, again lining up pretty close with that June 30th date that CoinDesk got the balance sheet for. And then again, 1 quarter later, at the very end of September, you see these massive hundreds of thousands of Ether move from FTX over to Alameda Research's Binance deposit address. And so I am keeping an eye there. And then there's a bunch of other exchanges, some of which have already shut off withdrawals, some of which seem to have had strange problems, like Crypto.com, which was implicated in some real weird transactions. At one point, they claimed they accidentally sent their entire cold storage basically over to Gate, which is another exchange, and then had to wait for Gate to send most of it back. And there was another series of transactions where the Crypto.com CEO tried to explain their deposits on other exchanges as them hedging user positions. And so I have many outstanding questions about what Crypto.com is doing, and I'm paying a lot of attention to them. And then broadly, we've also seen a whole bunch of hedge funds come out, well, not a whole bunch, a half dozen at least hedge funds come out and say, hey, we had a lot or a significant portion of our assets on FTX, and we may not see those for years. So it'll be interesting to see more of those that get revealed. And then the final part is like on June 30th, Alameda had like $7.4 billion in loans. I am curious how many loans were still outstanding. Carolyn said they were mostly paid back, but I expect there are loan books in crypto which still have exposure to Alameda, and some of them have probably been less than fully forthright about their total exposure to Alameda and related entities.
Isn't the irony in all this that the whole value out of crypto was supposed to be that it would save us from theft and fraud?
That's among the ironies.
Bennett, thanks so much for doing this. We're really grateful. Congratulations on all the success you're having. I think that you are one of the stars in the crypto world that we turn to. Your Twitter feed, if you're not following Bennett on Twitter, I don't know what you're doing. It is an absolutely fantastic feed. He's always on it and explains stuff better than anyone. For our audience that wants to get more of your content, where can they go to?
Sure. So like you said, I'm at Bennett Tomlin on Twitter. Cass and I host the Crypto Critics Corner podcast, which you can find on YouTube or wherever else there are podcasts. And I also write for Protos Media.
Awesome. Thanks so much for doing this, Bennett.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Steve.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for watching. And if you could do me a big favor, please hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell so we keep making more of this content for y'all.